Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending upon where you are. I'm Don Hester, and today we're going to be talking about vulnerability scanning and pen testing. I'm being joined by Dragus from Qualys, who's going to talk about their platform and how they can help you with vulnerability management and scanning, and Robert DeRook from Indiana University, who recently passed the CompTIA Pen Test Plus certification. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. What I've found when I've worked as an auditor is I oftentimes get people that call me and they say, hey, I need a pen test, or I need this, or I need that. And when I start to talk to them and say, okay, what do you need the pen test for? Why are you running a pen test? You know, so we can figure out what the scope is and what we're trying to accomplish with the pen test. It ends up turning out that they're typically asking for vulnerability scanning. So I've decided that we needed to talk about what the difference is between vulnerability scanning and what we're testing there, and pen testing and what we're testing there, because we're doing two different things, and one doesn't replace the other. We need both, depending upon our situation. So I wanted to start off by talking what is pen testing, and Robert may add into this a little bit too. I'm just going off of what is on the NIST glossary, and basically it's saying that it's a methodological method of testing that is designed to circumvent the controls that you have in the system, to show that there is a hole that you can get into a system. So as a part of that, we're also then verifying how well that system can stand up to hackers attacking it. So in this instance, we're actually really mimicking a real-world attack on real systems. It's not a fake system that's set up. It's the real system, the live system. And we have hackers and attackers, sometimes automated, sometimes actual individuals, who are trying to break into the system. And part of this, it may not always be the reason why we're doing incident response or pen testing. One of the things that we're testing, possibly, because we can do different levels of pen testing, is the organization's ability to, one, find out that there's an incident happening, and two, how they can react to it. So if we're doing a pen test in that way, sometimes you'll see the term red team, blue team, and the red team being the hackers trying to break in, the pen testers, and the blue team being the incident responders. Typically, we don't want to tell the incident responders that we're going to be attacking at any particular time, because we want to do it. We want to see if they can even catch us in the first place, and then how do they respond to it. So that's a pen test. And Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so really the goal of a pen test is, one is to find the vulnerabilities that may exist, regardless if it's a system, a resource, being a human resource, or a physical resource like a door or something like that. Is to list it, to find out in what exactly those vulnerabilities are. And the second step of a pen test is to actually exploit those vulnerabilities. So what's the likelihood, or how easy is it to actually circumvent the controls that are in place once you find a vulnerability? I'll give you a quick example here. So you're going to do a physical pen test, right, to a facility. You find it has a door lock. What type of door lock is it? It's what they typically classifies a tumbler door lock, right? Most of us know the tumblers. A typical key lock, for example, it's got serrated edges on the key. Those map to different points for the tumblers to pass a particular shear line that then unlocks the tumbler, so it unlocks the door. So a test for that would be, how easy is it to pick that lock, right? Because the vulnerability is the lock itself, right? How sophisticated and complex the lock is. Well, if it's very easy or a very standard lock, you can pick it with two pieces of metal, for example, of a lock picking set, and you can get in through the door. That's an example of finding the vulnerability of the door lock itself, and then how easy is it to exploit that door lock. As you progress up through different door locks, so you get crypto locks, you get RFID badge lock, you get biometric locks, they become more and more challenging to bypass that particular control. A vulnerability assessment would just say, yes, we have a door lock, right? The pen test actually goes through and tells you how easy or how difficult it is for that particular vulnerability to be exploited. And that's a key thing as a difference between those two kind of tests.
Yeah, and I think part of that, it helps you do a risk-based decision, right? So if it is easy to break, then that is a vulnerability that needs to be corrected as soon as possible. I want to add to what Rob said 2 points. One is that it also sometimes includes physical breaches of the physical security systems. And another thing with pen testing is that the hackers don't try to find every possible vulnerability and exploit every possible vulnerability. They find one, maybe two, exploit it, and then once they're inside, they then try to escalate privileges once they're inside the organization and go from there. So pen testing is not going to give you an exhaustive list of all the vulnerabilities you have. They may find one and then not discover another one that could still be out there. And that's why you want to look at automated scanning services that can actually scan that and find all those, so you have them all enumerated, so you know what all your vulnerabilities are. So one thing I wanted to talk about is, like, why is everybody always asking about pen tests? So the biggest requirement for security standards out there that requires pen testing is PCI. So PCI DSS requires that you have pen testing capabilities, or you outsource it so that somebody can come do it. They want you to pen test the perimeter of your cardholder data environment. So that's what the CDE means, cardholder data environment. So the area that you've separated out or segmented, that is where the cardholder information is processed, transmitted, or stored, that whole system, and if you're on the network side of things, you think of the network of that and all the different connections that are a part of it. You want to test the outside of it. So it'll be the firewall, yes, but if you're using VLANs for segmentation, you need to also test those things. That's a part of the perimeter, and so you have to test that. You can do that from the inside or the outside of your network, because if you segmented the internal portion of your network, whatever it is, I deal with a lot of local governments, so what they end up doing is, like, the city's network is separate. They have a separate subnet or maybe a separate VLAN set up for just the processing of credit cards. They need to do a pen test in there against that VLAN to verify that that VLAN doesn't have any weaknesses that can be exploited. So that's the inside and the outside, because obviously you're going to do the firewall from the outside. And that's part of 11.3, validating your network segmentation that it's correct. You should also look at doing pen tests on the application layer. It's not just the network layer that they're looking for. It's interesting that they really don't talk a whole lot about the physical, but they specifically call out the application layer. So obviously the network and the application are required, and they do talk in very vague terms in PCI DSS that they recommend that you use an industry standard such as NIST 800, forget the one it is, it's the one on assessments. And in that one, it talks about all the different types of pen testing available. So they're kind of pointing you in that direction, but not specifically saying physical is one of the things that they specifically looked at. You're expected to do external pen tests at least annually, or if you've had a significant change to the network or the application, and do that internally as well, annually again, or if there's a significant change. So internally and externally are both required. And pen testing any segmentation should also be done annually. One point to make to this, and Robert can add to this afterwards, one of the requirements for PCI DSS is that the person doing the pen test is qualified. Now, PCI DSS does not have a certification for individuals to do pen testing, so it's going to rely upon SANS or CompTIA's new certification to demonstrate that your employees, if you use your own internal employees, or if you use an external employee, external contractor or whatever, that they know that they have the qualifications to do a pen test. And I don't know, Rob, if you want to add a little bit about CompTIA's new certification.
Sure. The new certification actually I found is along the lines of the other security cert that CompTIA has recently released last year, the CYSA Plus. Both of those are implemented performance-based testing now. So it's no longer just a series of questions and answers. You now are tasked with actually conducting portions of a penetration test. They'll give you a simulation environment as best they can. They kind of lock it down to some of the tool sets that are available to you. They'll give you taskings that you have to actually complete. You do those taskings, and then you save that particular question, and then you move on to the traditional certification exam questions. But I really liked it because it covered a wide range of different tasks from a penetration testing standpoint. And I'll give you a couple of examples because you touched on it just briefly with the particular compliance testing. When you go through a pen test, there's really three different objectives when you look at it. One is what they call compliancy-based pen test, and that is exactly what you've just listed. You are testing against a regulation that has been adopted by a regulation of some kind, like PCI DSS, for example. They'll have specific things listed in there that you have to accomplish. Another one is the red team test that you mentioned earlier, being the traditional looked at as a hacker, and this is tell me what you find, right? You go through the process of attacking a particular system or a network or a physical location, and then you give a report back as to what your findings were. And then the last one is objectives-based, right? And that one could be somewhat tied in with what you just said with PCI, is that it's tagged to like testing an application. I want that tested to see what the outcome is. So the certification process helps validate that the person who's actually performing the test knows what they're doing, so that in the event that something is exposed, it is taken care of, right? It is maybe escalated through a chain of communication to the intended target or the company that has hired you to do the pen test, that you've informed them right away if you find like an evidence of a previous compromise that they did not know about, right? So those are some of the things that you get out of the Pen Test Plus. And like I said, for me, I thought it was a really good certification exam for it. There's a couple of others. There's SANS has a couple for certification. CEH has a couple for penetration tester, and Kali Linux, the group that creates the kind of the live Linux distro for penetration testing, for example. They have their own offensive, they call it the offensive security, it's the OCSP certification.
Right, yeah.
So there's a couple of them that are out there.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that, Rob. So you know that they're out there, so that's what you should be looking for when you're looking for pen testers. Talking about other certifications are different standards that also require NIST Special Publication 853. I'm quoting the Revision 5 draft, which is currently out there in draft form and will be, I don't know, for the next 6 months or so, probably finalized. There are different things that they look for in the pen test that they're looking for. Notice that their requirements are different than the PCI. It's not talking about internal and external. They talk about independence. They talk about red team exercise. They talk about the physical pen testing, facility penetration testing. They kind of give you their ideas of what it's trying to do, and that's to determine the degree of that a system can resist penetration. But key point to this is if you know 853, there's 3 different baselines, low, moderate, and high. So if you have a low-level system, it has a different set of controls that you look at, and if it's a moderate-based system, they add some more, and if it's a high-based system, they add some more. This is only required for a high-based system. So most local governments, if you're a local government, you're probably fitting into, and most practitioners say, go for the moderate baseline. Low is too low and high is too high, so hit the moderate one. That's what most individuals recommend for local governments. Most local government data is at a moderate level, so it's appropriate, I think. You may have some high-level information if you have life safety, and then you might jump that up to a high if you had life safety systems that were a part of it. Then you might look at something like a pen test for those systems only. But if you understand 853, and 837, how it says to set up the risk management framework, which I know a lot of the local governments aren't fully vested in understanding. You would look at your different, you may set up separate systems, one for high and one for moderate. So most of the city's network would be on moderate and the rest would be on high. If you had critical infrastructure, that might be considered high if you're local government. If you're federal government, you know all this because it's already figured out for you. One last thing before I get into vulnerability scanning, I forgot to say in the last slide, and it's ISO 27001 has no requirement for this in their baseline. So pen testing is not a requirement. They do have a requirement that's kind of vague about vulnerability management, and under there you can say, well, I should be doing pen testing. But it's not specifically like a separate section in like it is with PCI or like it is with NIST. So ISO in this instance, because again, they only have one, they don't have like the multiple levels and like NIST has, or PCI's requirements where you have to do it. So vulnerability scanning is typically a technique that we use to look at all the hosts and look at all the attributes and find all the associated vulnerabilities with it. So you're looking for vulnerabilities, but you're also kind of looking for configuration issues as well. You may also be doing some inventory testing with this because it may also then look for and find new devices that you weren't aware that you had. I find that every time that we run a scan like this, and I did it for a couple different local cities where we did a couple different scans on the internal side, and they found stuff that they didn't know that they had. It wasn't in their documentation. Maybe it was an old switch that hasn't been patched, but they forgot about it. Somehow it fell out of inventory, or from the normal network segment where we ran a map, we were able to find the CCTV cameras on the network, which we weren't supposed to be able to see from the scanning, from the subnet that we were on doing the scanning. So vulnerability scanning can help with the inventory, but it also can figure out the vulnerability and configuration issues as well. And typically this is an automated process. So when we talk about vulnerabilities in this instance, we're talking about technical vulnerabilities of applications and systems and hosts. We're not talking about vulnerabilities in process, because you can't scan for a vulnerability in process, but you can look for process vulnerabilities. For example, if the process is when someone gets fired, HR makes a request to IT to remove the individual's access to systems, and it doesn't happen, that's a vulnerability, right? So the process failed. So when we're talking about it here for the rest of this thing, we're talking about the technical ones, not the process ones. But I don't want you to think that there's only technical ones. I want to make sure that you understood that there's other ones. So PCI has requirements for this as well, quite extensive. You need to do at least quarterly internal and external scans. Now, most organizations that I find, because we resell Qualys is one of the things, they sign up for the external that's required to be turned in, but they don't sign up for the internal. And a lot of organizations aren't not doing the internal scanning. And I think that's really, you're missing the point of why you want to do scanning if you're not doing it internally as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But we want to identify all the vulnerabilities. I look at it this way. You want to know all the potential vulnerabilities that a potential hacker may use to get into your system, not just the ones they actually did exploit. And here's the other thing. You may find a vulnerability, and guess what? It's not something that can be exploited by them today, but maybe tomorrow it is. So generally, you want to patch everything as soon as you can. So you want to, PCI says, hey, you need to set up some type of way of identifying the risks. You need to also look at the web applications, especially if they're web applications that you have developed in-house, custom-coded items. They're also looking for, after any significant change to the network or application that you're running scans. Internal scans should be done by qualified personnel. In other words, somebody that understands how the scans work. When Qualys comes on after this and they talk about it, there's different settings that you can set for the scan. You could just scan for SANS top 20. That's not adequate for PCI purposes. You need to run like a PCI scan on your internal network. And there's a setting for that, so you need to know that. So that's a little bit about the qualified personnel. And also kind of gets back to what Rob was talking about. I think Qualys has training that you can go through. I've gone through it so that you understand how their product works, at least. And I know some of the other vendors have training as well. External scans, however, the ones you turn into your bank or merchant bank or whoever your processor is, have to be done by a PCI ASV. It's an approved scanning vendor, and you have to annually go in, run scans as an ASV to turn that into the PCI Council so they can validate that you know how to do scans. Qualys is one of those that's approved. There's other vendors out there that are approved as well. And then they tell you that if you fail to scan, you need to keep on scanning until all the vulnerabilities are gone. Not all the vulnerabilities, but all of them at a certain level, until they're all finished and gone. So they have some very specific requirements for PCI. Now, NIST 853, and I'm again pulling from the revision 5 draft, under specialized assessments there is, it's like a bucket list of like, what might you need based upon risk, and it kind of falls in there. But it also falls under specifically RA5, that you're scanning for vulnerabilities, that you're updating the signatures for those vulnerabilities that you're scanning. You look for what can be discovered about a system, so you're fingerprinting the system to determine what kind of system it is. You're also looking for privileged access and authentication. You're looking for, and privileged access means that you can do an authenticated scan, because that gets you a lower false positive rate when you run a scan. Automated trend analysis, logging and analysis, and correlating scan information. Now, if you have a low system, if you understand how NIST 853 works, you have to do RA5, which is scan for vulnerabilities, and then part 2, which is update that scanning signature. If you're a moderate-based system, you have to add on to that 5, which is RA55, which is privileged access, means doing authenticated scans. And then if you are a high-level system, you have to add on to it figuring out what can be discovered about a system, which is RA54, the fourth little supplemental control to the RA5 control. Notice there's a bunch of other things here listed that are not in the low, moderate, and high list, and that's just another thing with NIST 853 is they give you all the controls, and then you can use some of these other controls if in your situation the risk is warranted that you need to do extra and go above and beyond. So it does it. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about is the cybersecurity framework, because a lot of local governments have been told that they should use this. It's really for critical infrastructure, and it's really basically a baby step. You really want to be, if you're a local government, want to be moving towards 853. They're meshing those two frameworks together so that and by the way, if you're doing 853 at a moderate level, you're already doing everything that you should be doing almost in the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's like 2 items that it's not doing, and it has to do with publicity after an incident. And that's being added into the new, because they're updating 853, because the current version 4 doesn't have it. And the new risk management framework is adding in privacy as a part of it, and that's going to address some of those other issues. But there's like only 1 or 2 items that are not addressed. Everything else is addressed in 853. And most of those are not things that the system admin does on the network side. It's more of things that the organization as a whole needs to deal with, and that is like, how do you deal with your reputation getting lost after an incident? So that's not really it is super important, but from a network admin side of things or a system admin side of things, it's maybe not as much. So they have the same type of thing here, but notice that the wording is far more vague, like, you know, have asset vulnerabilities and identify and document them. Okay, well, that's kind of vague. You can see that PCI and 853 are much more what they're looking for, that you do perform the scans. And by the way, if you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, it points back to 853 for all the guidance for all of these different controls. So again, 853 is really the one you should be looking at. I have personal opinions on how NIST did this, and I don't agree with them. I think they really should train people how to use 853, because that's the biggest barrier for most local and state organizations from adopting it. It's because they don't know how to adopt it. And it's not that difficult. It just requires a little bit of explanation. Anyways, so if you're doing 853, you're doing that. Now, ISO 27001 does have some requirements for doing managing your technical vulnerabilities. However, an important point to that is everything that's required in RA5 and NIST is not covered by ISO. So again, ISO is somewhat stepped back from the, I don't know how to say it, 853 is more, it's larger, it has a larger space of controls, and ISO 27001, as you see, has a narrower focus on it. So you have, for vulnerability scans, it doesn't fully do it. And there's no corresponding controls for penetration testing unless you're kind of inferring the management of information security incidents improvements. Well, how are you going to improve unless you have an incident? Well, you can do a pen test, right, to improve on that. And so that would be doing testing. So there's not a specific corresponding control, but it's maybe possibly implied, or you could imply that that is what the control is looking for. Obviously, there's other ways to improve your incident response with 27001. One of the other things I find as an auditor is a lot of people just try to do the external scan. And I went through and met with a couple different cities that are clients of mine, and I said, hey, I'm going to give you some free scans. I want to do internal and external. And we typically find these type of results is that if we just do an external scan, we maybe find 10 vulnerabilities in the DMZ. And that's because the firewall is doing its job. It's blocking traffic, and it's, so some vulnerabilities that may exist in the DMZ or your screen subnet, depending on how it's set up, may not exist or may not be seeable from the outside world. However, if a hacker does get past your firewall, you really want to know every vulnerability that they might see that they might want to exploit once they get past the firewall. And so I almost think it's better, I think you kind of need both, but if I had to only pick one, I'd only pick the internal scans, not picking just the external scans. Because the firewall is doing its job, it's to obscure a lot of them. But I want to know, as a system admin or IT manager, I want to know exactly what all the vulnerabilities are so that I can make sure that they all get patched, so that if the code or malicious software gets past the firewall, I know what could possibly happen or what could possibly be exploited. That's kind of what I'm looking at. And I would do the internal network as well. We did a couple different cities, and we found all kinds of issues once we did a scan internally. I think I had one city that had everything fairly locked down, but the other cities that I did, we found all kinds of different networks. We found all kinds of stuff. One of them, we were able to get into the internal network and run scans. That means a hacker, if they got past the firewall in any way, shape, or form, now they're inside. And now what are they going to see? What can they use or exploit to escalate their privileges? So that's kind of where you want to look at that, is make sure that you're doing the internal and external. I know that there's a requirement for the externals to be done by ASVs, and that's why a lot of people think, oh, I'm meeting the PCI standard by doing it, but you're supposed to be doing internal ones as well. So that's a thing that you want to make sure that you're looking at. Also, one of the things that I think is very important is, like, how do you improve this process? And I was talking to a friend of mine who was doing another presentation for the AICPA, and we had a little bit of a disagreement on why you're doing scanning and what you would do to improve it. For me, I want to go to that maturity level that we kind of talked about in that last session that I think we had. And again, you can look at COBIT, you can look at CMMI to look at a spectrum of maturity that an organization has. When you get all the way to the highest level, optimized, that's where you're trying to figure out, I did a scan, okay, we need to go patch all that stuff, but let me find out why that patch wasn't patched before we ran the scan. So for example, let's say you run a scan and you go in and you patch everything. And then you run another scan next month. You go and patch everything. You run next month after that, you run a scan and you find a bunch of things, you patch it. We all know vulnerabilities come out every day, right? There's all new vulnerabilities, and so we know that we're always going to be scanning and patching things. The question that we have to look at, how do we make sure that our scans come out better? How do we improve those? And that's where we're looking at getting better results, and that is when we do the scan, And if I look at the scan, and Qualys reports are really good for this, I really like that, they tell you when the vulnerability was announced and when the patch was announced. So if I look at a scan as an auditor, and I see that there is a vulnerability that existed and the patch has been available for a year, I know that there's a problem with their patch management process, right? Because if you think about it, if they had a proper patch management process, that should be patched within 30 days. According to PCI, it has to be patched within 30 days. NIST doesn't require a specific time frame, but 30 days is probably pushing it, especially with all the 0 days out there. You really want to get it as soon as possible. So within 30 days, are you patching things? So if the patch is available and it's 90 days out and you've been running scans, how are you going to improve your scans? Well, you got to go back to your patch management process and say, okay, why did we miss that scan, and how do we make sure that we catch it next time? So patch management, configuration management is a part of that. It's not just patch management, because scans also look for configuration management, and that could be a part of your change control process as well. That may be a part of that. Also, if you look at the pen test side of things, we're finding and exploiting the vulnerabilities, not just finding them, and you're possibly testing your incident response. So yes, we're testing our patch management process there and our configuration management or change control, but we're also testing our incident response possibly, and we're also possibly testing our intrusion detection capabilities. And again, when we have these, we did a vulnerability scan, we did a pen test, how do we use the results from that to improve these other processes that should exist? Otherwise, you're just fighting fires. Right? You just go out, you do your scan, you're done, and then next month you do it again. Well, you're not getting better, and what we want you to do is get better. And so that's one of the things that I think is very important that we look at when we scan. And as far as an auditor goes, when I see this, I always try to advise clients, take the results from vulnerability scans and pen tests, put it back into the process and say, how can I improve this, so that I'm not ending up with 90-day, patches that are out there that haven't been patched for 90 days. How do I get that process better? So that when you are running scans, you're finding less items, right? Because otherwise, if you're just scanning and then fixing and scanning and fixing, that's the wrong way to do it. Patch. Scan to validate that the patch has been applied, right? So put the patch management first. Make sure that that's a robust process that you have, and get it forward. So I don't know if, Rob, if you have any last words. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Qualys if you don't have anything, Rob.
Just that I put into the announcements section several links for both penetration and vulnerability scans, including Qualys. So people can directly go to any of those links in the presenter to audience announcements section.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And by the way that I keep the lights on and pay for this and can give you this free training is we're a Qualys approved reseller, and we specialize in local governments, state and local, and we have special pricing for that. So other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Dragos, who is going to give us an overview of Qualys's platform. We'll talk about some of it, not everything, because they have a lot of tools that are available to them. Are you there, Dragos?
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot for the very good introduction and explanation about what pen testing is and what vulnerability scanning is and how do they work together. Obviously, Qualys is very well positioned in the vulnerability testing. We're one of the first vendors that built a cloud platform that
Are you there? I think we lost you.
The attack surface. And I'll start from looking a bit at what is the reality today. And obviously, we all know that a lot of organizations get breached. Actually, a hard number, a statistic shows that about 70% of organizations got compromised within the past 12 months, which is a very, very high number. So if we ask ourselves the question, can we stay safe in today's reality? And the answer doesn't sound very well. And the naked truth is that there's no such thing as 100% security. There are some things that we can do, and it very much depends on those things that we do in order to limit the attack surface, to close some of the doors that we leave open so the attacker might use to come in. So the discussion turns more towards how you can build an efficient cybersecurity program that would use the least amount of resources in order to produce the biggest effect, to have the biggest value for you. So it is more about how you can build that cybersecurity program rather than just trying to block everything, because that simply won't work. So it's more about understanding what are the best practices, what are the larger organizations, the companies who have a lower risk of getting breached, what are they doing, and to learn a bit from those things, and then to try to use that in building our own security program. So if we look at some of the latest breaches, and if we put them on a map with one of the axes being complexity and the other one being severity, we obviously recognize that there are some breaches, like for example the Kaspersky hack, where we have nation-state actors who are using zero-day exploits, who are using highly sophisticated malware, and in all honesty, most organizations don't stand too many chances against these kind of attacks. And this is one of the examples. We have a leading cybersecurity company who got breached, and they haven't been able to detect even that attack for several months. So there are things that you can do for that, and mainly those things are around understanding the presence, how they move laterally, what are the activities that they would do in your network. But what I would like to talk more about today is about the vast majority of the rest successful attacks. Those are kind of attacks that were not sophisticated. They didn't use any kind of zero-day exploits or any kind of zero-day vulnerabilities. They were just plain commodity malware, and the average detection from the infection to the detection time is about 180 days. That's a huge number, and basically, there are some I would call them. There are some vulnerabilities that we need to look at. And we need to understand how we can deal with them, because the problem is the volume. When we talk about vulnerabilities, we have about 7,000 new vulnerabilities which are disclosed every year. About 30 to 40% of them are actually ranked as being critical. So how do you actually deal with 3,000 vulnerabilities that you would want to patch every year? That's a pretty high number. So another thing that we see is that the mean time to weaponize. So the attackers are actually building exploits and using those backdoors, the vulnerabilities, in order to weaponize usually legit traffic or legit documents, and they're using those as weaponized objects in order to try to attack you. So what we observe is that the mean time to weaponize is decreasing every year, and we can actually look at an example. And I think everybody heard about WannaCry, and we can talk a little bit about what happened there and what was the reaction time, and then what were the subsequent actions. So WannaCry basically was announced. Well, the Microsoft MS 17010 patch was announced sometime in mid-March, And from that time, a lot of organizations were running a mature cybersecurity program. They started their they usually run weekly scanning and detection cycles. And they started to scan for that. And usually the first part of the detection is done by an authenticated or with an agent based, simply because you don't have all the signatures built in order to have an unauthenticated detection. So there is a matter of about 1 week that a time frame of about 1 week that they were scanning their network, and then they started to detect that, and then they started a remediation process. They were starting to patch things, and the infections, the number of infections started to drop a little bit. At some point in time, about 1 month later, we got Eternal Blue exploit, which was basically the first exploit that used the vulnerability in order to create any kind of damage. And again, we saw a spike in terms of infection. That was the time that vendors started to produce the unauthenticated detection. So we were able to get to understand the effects on the network and on the endpoint in a way that we were able to actually run unauthenticated detection. Again, we had pretty similar cycle. We got about 1 week. That was the scan time to start detecting the new infections, and then we got into a continuous remediation process, which again, mature cybersecurity programs had. At some point in time, about 1 month later, we got WannaCry, and WannaCry was really had a really bad impact, and a lot of people got very scared, and they started to do what we called an emergency patching process. Now, as you can see, there were some times where people got notified about the danger, about the threat, and they got some time to actually scan their environment, to actually do something about it. But most organizations didn't actually react until it was really too late for them, and it was really they saw an immediate very big danger, and that's when they started doing a kind of emergency patching. So when we're starting to look at how we can build a cybersecurity program, those are the kind of things that we want to stay away from. That we need to make sure that we're having a regular scanning process that happens really it has a good pace, it has a good cadence. And then we have a remediation process that we focus on the most dangerous vulnerabilities. And building a cybersecurity program, building a vulnerability management program is all about how you can detect fast and how you can prioritize. You won't be able to solve all the security problems in 1 or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, the kind of time windows that you would have nowadays in order to patch the systems. So you need to understand what are the ones which are dangerous to you, and you need to understand where you need to actually focus your effort. Another thing that we see in the wild is that a lot of vulnerabilities which get announced, and even if they are critical, they don't actually have associated exploits. So the rough number is that 7% of the vulnerabilities have exploits. And what we see is that there's a dark web out there. There are people that are building those kind of exploits. There are people that are actually selling. Most of the exploits, when they're built, they actually get sold on the dark web, on the dark market. And the people that created them, they usually make money by selling those vulnerabilities and those exploits, the information that you need to know in order to actually exploit a vulnerability. And that's the way that they make money. Why they do that? Well, simply because you don't get a big risk in building an exploit. You get a big risk when you're trying to use it, right? So they try to stay away from using it. They're building exploit, they sell the exploit, they make a lot of money in the process, but they don't actually touch the victim directly with their bare hands. So they're kind of smart, and they're trying to do that in a very smart way. And speaking about how smart they got, we've seen a lot of automation that happens in the attack lifecycle. So if we look at one typical transaction that you are doing daily, you're going to your PC and you're going to visit a website, right? So what actually happens is that your web browser makes a request to the web server. The web server is compromised at some point in time. So they first compromise the web server, and the web server first tries to understand what is your vulnerability posture, what kind of operating system you have, what kind of browser you have, and what are the vulnerabilities that this operating system or browser have. And then, in a fully automated way, they would serve you the answer that embeds a weaponized document, which somehow has a vulnerability that they can exploit on your system. So you see, they're actually building a kind of artificial intelligence, if you want, automation in the attack lifecycle. So that kind of process is very fast, and the reaction time that you need to have on the other side needs to be also very fast. So we need to talk about automation in the way that we discover vulnerabilities, and also automation in the way that we patch for, at least for the common vulnerabilities. Otherwise, you don't really stand a chance against this kind of smart threat actors. So if we talk about how we can build an efficient VM program, there are a few components, actually 4 components that we need to take care of. First, and that's really important, you need to understand what are your assets in your environment. You need to classify them. You need to understand where those assets are. Not only across your on-premise site, but also across cloud, across virtual virtual cloud subscriptions, because you cannot secure what you don't know. Once you understand what you have, you need to have the technology and the practice to actually build a vulnerability view, a vulnerability posture, to understand what is the vulnerability posture for each and every one of those assets. You end up by detecting a matter of hundreds, usually thousands of vulnerabilities in a typical network. So it's a really big effort even to try looking at them. So one of the most important things that we're talking about today is how you can understand what is the threat which is associated with each vulnerability. And the threat is not only the severity of the vulnerability, because as we were talking before, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that don't have an actual exploit which is active in the wild at that point in time. So you would be better off if you focus your efforts on the ones which actually have an active exploit, or the ones which actually can move laterally, or the ones that somebody might be able to find to find an exploit on the dark web, and then to buy that and to attack you using that. So when we talk about the threat and the prioritization of the remediation process for the vulnerability management, you need to have an additional layer of threat intelligence, which would combine information about the vulnerabilities that you detected and the severity that they have, which of course is very important to have, but you need to combine that info with the actual usability of that information, of that vulnerability by the attacker, and that's exploitation part. So only this combination will actually give you the right view of where you should focus first your efforts. And once you understand that, you obviously need to move into a patch cycle, and you need to actually make sure that you patch the vulnerable system as fast as you can. And we're trying to build automation into this whole process in a way that you would run periodic scans. You would we're talking today about running continuous scans even. So there are scans which end and then the other scans which begin, or we're talking about running a endpoint software on your asset that would continuously detect any kind of new vulnerability that asset might have. So if we look at the first part, so about how you can know all the assets, Qualys has a really good way to help you with that. We do have a technology that enables you to run a discovery process. We call that mapping. So the mapping basically is a scan in your network that would target a certain domain or a certain IP range. And what you find using that scan is you basically discover all your live assets there, right? And that's one of the most important parts in any kind of security program, not only vulnerability management, because knowing the assets is the first step to actually starting to secure them. And we can go and discover the assets. We can show you what are the categories, what are the hardware types of those assets, what are the vendors, what are the software types, and we can break those down into different categories so you can organize them. The idea is to discover them and to organize them in groups or to tag them in a way that it would be easier for you to work with them, and you could develop different cybersecurity programs for every group. The next step in building a cybersecurity program would be to run frequent scans, and you can detect and measure the vulnerability posture and also misconfigurations. So there are two kinds of scans basically that you can run. One of them is a vulnerability scan. The vulnerability scan would detect what are the vulnerabilities that you have with one particular asset or throughout your entire network. So here you would have things like, for example, you haven't installed the latest patch for your operating system, or you're running an older version of Java that's vulnerable to this kind of attack. So that's the kind of information that you will get out of a VM scan. The other kind of scan that you can run is a compliance scan, and that deals with the way that the assets are configured. And you detect misconfigurations. Like, for example, you want to implement a password policy that would demand that all your accounts would have at least a password of at least 10 characters, and they need to change that password every 2 months, right? That's a kind of a policy. And that's a technical configuration you can automatically check, and you can scan for that on all your assets, on all your domains. So that's the kind of compliance scan that you would run in your network. Once you understand the vulnerabilities and the configuration problems, you need to start prioritizing those in order to build a remediation process. And prioritization is basically about understanding what the associated risk with each vulnerability or with each misconfiguration. And that's done by overlaying a threat intelligence view on top of the vulnerability detections. In that way, you can understand not only what's the severity of each vulnerability, but you can also understand what's the exploitability, if you want, exploitation, how easy it is to exploit that vulnerability, and how easy it is for an attacker to use that particular vulnerability to actually attack you. Qualys is developing a patch management system where we're going to launch this system in a couple of months from now, so by the end of the year, and that system is called patch management, and we're going to have the ability to actually push patches in an automated way. So once we detect a vulnerability, you will be able to configure what are the vulnerabilities that you want to automatically patch. And the patch basically is done by an agent, an endpoint agent that you install on your asset. And that agent is going to be able to actually grab the patch grab the software, install the patch, confirm the installation, make sure that the patch is fully installed, and then report back to our platform so you can actually close the loop and know for sure that that the security problem is gone. Now, what we spoke about until now basically covers pretty much on-premise and endpoint. So you have different sites, different on-premise assets, and then you have like mobile users, people that are actually roaming. You have sales agents, which are which might have a different physical location every day. But there are some trends in the industry. Everybody's talking about digital transformation. As part of the digital transformation, there's a lot of migration towards virtualization, and we talk now about moving a lot of workloads to the cloud, to the infrastructure as a service, and we're talking here about AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, or moving toward a container development, software development, where the big name here is Docker. Everybody's trying to use application virtualization to build microservices. So most of the developers today are actually trying to migrate from the traditional old architecture towards the containerized ones, because those have really good advantages in terms of speed, in terms of resource utilization, in terms of scalability. So when you build a cybersecurity program, when you build a vulnerability management program, you need to take in consideration all those environments, and you need to build a platform which is able to have a unified view on all those environments. Because if you have a view for the on-premise systems, you have another view for the endpoints, you have another view for cloud and for container, then you'll end up having too many systems that are not interconnected with each other, and that would actually eat a lot of time, and you won't have unified view. You won't have time to focus on them, and you end up, but you end up not doing what you should do. So I'll give you just one example. In many conversations that we have, the security guys say, okay, we already know all the aspects, but they're actually migrating towards cloud. And if they're using, for example, Microsoft Azure, one of the advantages of using Microsoft Azure is that you have access to the marketplace, and then you can download the images which are available in this marketplace. So the exercise that we did was to actually take the one Red Hat image from that marketplace, and then we took the image. We even deployed. There is an automatic way to deploy a Qualys agent that does the vulnerability management. So when you actually spin up the instance, the instance gets an agent, a Qualys agent, and then does an automatic vulnerability scanning. And the vulnerability results for that particular scan was that it was we were able to detect about 24 vulnerabilities, out of which one was severity 5 and about I think 16 were severity 4. So it didn't look like it was a very clean image. Now, was it something wrong with that particular image? Well, no, it didn't actually contain malware. But from the moment that image got published into the cloud environment, to the moment that they actually start using it, there was some time, right? And that time accounted for the discovery of new vulnerabilities. And it's always when you're starting using resources that you don't control fully, you will get this kind of situations. And to make this even worse, if we look at an exploitability posture, so what are the exploits that are available in the wild that somebody can use against you? We ended up finding 72 exploits that were able to use those 20-something vulnerabilities. So That's one example how digital transformation, how you migrating to a cloud environment, even if it's a good thing, and you should be doing that, of course, because there are a lot of advantages in doing that, would actually create a much more dynamic environment. You get this kind of installations of new systems every day, and the average life cycle, the average time that such a system lives is, I don't know, can be days, sometimes can be weeks. So if you're running a vulnerability scan every week and you have 4 days or 5 days that every instance lives in average, then how can you actually cover that, right? So we're basically talking about a much faster pace in terms of resource utilization and resource creation. And then we need to bake that into the vulnerability management or the cybersecurity program to account for these rapid changes. Otherwise, we will be several steps behind and we will never have a good visibility which is up to date, because the attackers will be able to move much faster than we do. So what Qualys does here is that as part of the same platform, as part of the same infrastructure, we're basically baking in public cloud visibility and assessment. So right now, with Qualys, you can have one unified view of not only all your on-premise assets, but you can see also what you have in the cloud, and you can see the resources that you have there, like for example instances, but also you can see the security groups, you can see the routing tables, and those resources, even if they don't have an operating system, they can also have vulnerabilities. Why? Because they can be misconfigured. I'll give you one example. You might have you might use AWS, and you might have an S3 bucket, that's a storage bucket, and that bucket is not properly configured, so that you don't have a security group which blocks access to that bucket from the outside. And you might have somebody that goes and connects from the outside and then steals some data from you. So that's one typical problem. Is that a vulnerability? Do you have actual piece of software which is wrong anywhere? Well, you don't. But the cloud, the control plane of the cloud environment is not properly configured. And it's equally important to be able to detect this kind of misconfiguration. And of course, we talk about how you can prioritize remediation for that, and this also helps with reducing the attack surface. Another example where a lot of customers, we see a lot of organizations are moving. They're moving their software development towards the container world. Obviously, the biggest name here is Docker. That's why Qualys developed a Docker security framework. So we've built our Docker image that you can use as a Qualys scanner. So you can deploy that image on all your Docker hosts, and basically that image acts like a vulnerability scanner. It can scan all the other Docker containers that are running at one particular moment in time at the runtime. But you can do something even more proactive than this. We are building integrations with Jenkins or Bamboo, which are basically CI/CD pipeline tools. That's where the developers are actually building their software, and that's where they are creating the Docker images. So we are helping them build a security gate, to ensure that any kind of image that they publish into a image registry, it is scanned first and it's compliant with a certain cybersecurity framework that you want. For example, you mandate that no image can leave the development cycle if it has vulnerabilities of severity 4 or 5. Right? So that's a very clear metric. It is a cybersecurity gate that you mandate, and then you make sure that everything that you build is according to a certain standard. That's, again, another example how on the dynamic movement from on-premise towards cloud, toward virtualized world, and then what are the things that you would need to consider in order to be to expand your vulnerability and compliance program to cover those aspects as well. So a couple of things that I would try to summarize from my presentation would be a set of best practices, how you would build an effective and efficient cybersecurity program. And obviously, you need to start with an asset inventory or an asset management. There is no way that you can secure what you don't understand you have. So running frequent discovery scans, making sure that you understand all your assets. Those assets are not only your PCs. Those needs to be your databases. Those needs to be your, IoT devices that you have in your network. Anything that communicates in the network is basically an asset for you, but it can be a source of threat. So understanding them and classifying them and building a policy according to their risk is the way to start your practice. Then running continuous scanning and reporting it is something that helps you detect vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. Qualys has we're working with 6 Sigma numbers, so we're basically have 7 nines in terms of accuracy for detection. So that's important because you won't be spending your time dealing with things which are not which are not accurate. The next thing to have in mind is prioritization. You cannot attend to all the problems in the same time. It takes weeks. Sometimes it takes months in order to remediate vulnerabilities. And it's an ongoing process because there will be new ones that are coming up and you will detect new ones and then you will need to attend to those ones as well. So knowing where to put the effort at any given moment in time, it is something that you have to bake into your cybersecurity program. Patching and remediation process it moves toward automation, toward artificial intelligence and automation, and you need to use that in order to keep the pace with attackers. I showed you one example where with a browser that they're actually changing the malware that they attack you with in an automated way based on the kind of browser that you use in order to browse that particular website. You need to have a similar system in order to detect and to react to the problems. Otherwise, you will not be keeping pace with them. And of course, we have to recognize that any kind of cybersecurity program will not be 100% bulletproof, and you need to have or you need to think about incident response. So there is no question if your organization might be breached. It's more about when can be breached, and then what are the processes, what are the tools, what are the experts that you have access when this happens, and what would be your reaction. And we talk about the reaction time because it's one thing to have the industry average of 100+ days between infection and detection, and then about 60 days in average between detection and remediation. And it's a completely different thing to drive that number down to a matter of hours, sometimes minutes, or whatever, it can be even days. But you're getting in control of that. You understand that you have a problem and you deal with the problem. And then you focus your senior security professionals to actually handle those security incidents rather than just being overwhelmed by the large number of alerts or security incidents if you don't filter them down and you don't build a program that would automatically detect and patch the kind of commodity of vulnerability and malware. And of course, everything needs to be built into a cybersecurity framework. You need to work with whatever cybersecurity framework you want. We have a lot of customers who actually take different pieces from different frameworks and they build their own. We have other customers that use, latest CIS benchmarks for their environment. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you have a process in order to measure compliance. You have a mature framework that you adhere to, and then you have a process to measure the compliance and your cybersecurity performance against that program. The actual habit of doing that is more important than what actual framework that you adhere to. At the end of the presentation, I just wanted to show you what Qualys can do. I don't know if you can see that very well. Basically, we do cover. We have moved a lot in the past years. We started from doing vulnerability management, and that's what Qualys is still very well known for. But we're actually doing anything which deals with asset management, asset inventory, helping you detect the assets and classify and organize them across any kind of infrastructure that you might have. Then we're helping you identify the vulnerability and the compliance posture with different set of applications. We call those applications. Those are basically cybersecurity services delivered out of a unified cloud platform. And we're also helping you have a unified view and get that unified view and incorporate the web application security as well. Everything works under a unified, under one single pane of glass. There is one single platform which has one single scanner, one single agent, and all that infrastructure is able to basically cover all those security domains that you have here. I'll stop here and I'll ask if you have any questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, there's a little feedback or little questions that you can ask us, and we can answer those. I want to thank Dracos for his presentation on Qualys's offerings and how they can help you with your patch management process and obviously inventory as well. I'm skipping through some of these slides really quick to get to the end here. These are just extra slides. You have to come to another presentation if you want to hear about those. If there's no more questions, if you have any questions, go ahead and fill them out. If you're an attendee, you are always welcome to self-report any continuing education that you may have to whatever body that you report your continuing education to. So we recommend you do that. We ask that you give us some feedback on this. Please rate this session. Follow us. If you have any questions after, or you're watching this afterwards, not live, recorded, you can contact us at learnsecurity.org. Fill out the questionnaire there, or fill out the contact us and send us a question. I did get some from last week, and some people are asking for some different classes or different sessions that we can cover some different things. So we're going to add that to what we're going to do for next time. So look forward to that. By the way, we don't have anything posted right now for classes coming up, but we are going to do one on PCI for local governments. Local governments have a specific issues in that they take credit cards in so many different ways. And then we're also going to do one on SQL security, so SQL databases and what you can do to secure those. So that's what's coming up. I don't see any questions. So if there's no questions, we're done. Unless you have anything to add, Rob or Draco?
No, I'm good.
All right. All right, well, thank you very much
for your time.
Thank you. We really appreciate it, taking time to fill this out for us. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time.